Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Ari. I'm a product designer and developer based in Sydney, Australia. And in this video, we're going to go over the absolute basic concepts of web development for designers. This is not a coding tutorial per se, we're just going to go through the absolute basic concepts of web development. However, I will be doing a HTML and CSS tutorial later where I will cover each of these topics a lot more in depth. I'm also not going to cover whether I think designers should code or not. I have already made a video about that and I will leave that in the cards above and I'll also link to it down below. This is going to be a long video, so as always, I have linked to the different sections of the video in the timestamps down below. Alright, throughout the rest of this video, we're going to try and put this simple website together to explain the different languages and concepts. As you can see, there is nothing special going on. It's just a super simple website. You've got your homepage, you've got your about page, and I've just added this page in order to explain what the hover and interaction states might look like as we code this. Alright, let's get it. Generally speaking, we work with two different types of developers, front-end and back-end. At a very high level, a front-end developer puts together everything that a user might see and interact with. So they build things like buttons, forms, drop-downs, carousels, and more. And a back-end developer builds this stuff that we usually don't see. So they might design and build databases, build the architecture, deal with authentication, create APIs, and more. As designers, we usually work and collaborate with both of these guys in order to bring our designs to life. To explain how we might work with different types of developers, I've put together this simple design. And let me just walk you guys through it very quickly. Basically, all it is a very simple sign-up flow. I've only designed for two simple states over here. One, which would be a successful sign-up. So a user might come over here, fill out their information, click on sign up, and they get to the dashboard. And then I also design another flow with a single check. And the check is to see whether or not the email address already exists. Technically speaking, there are other checks that we should do when we design a sign-up flow like this, like to check for the wrong email format or to make sure that the input fields are not empty and more. But to keep things simple, let's just go ahead with the email address already exists check. The user might come over here, fill out the information, and then they would get this error over here, which then lets them know that the email address already exists within the system and offers them different options. In this case, sign in instead, where they could go over here, enter the password, sign in, and get to the dashboard. Now, let's say that we're happy with this design and we want to pass this on to the front end and the back end developers in order for them to take care of the different parts of this design. The front end developer would generally put together this whole UI, everything that you see over here, the different states for the fields like error state, the loading animations for the button, and depending on the front-end dev, they might even make database calls and checks in order to register this user. The back-end developer in this case would design things like the database that takes this user's details, take care of the security part, save this user's details within the database, or check to see if they already exist and communicate that to the front-end developer in order to let the user know and take the appropriate action. Now, of course, I'm simplifying what developers do, but I'm hoping that this example clarifies the difference between front-end and back-end developers. For the most part, we're focusing on front-end developers in this video. With that clarified, let's move on and explain how a typical website or web app goes from design all the way through to code. Generally speaking, the UI and the front end of every website is built using three different languages or technologies: HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. For native apps, this can change and we'll cover those in a different video about iOS and Android. Before we get started, I want to introduce you guys to the box analogy. This is a completely made up term and I don't know if anyone else is using it, but basically I want you guys to think of your designs as a bunch of boxes that we organize in order to create a layout. This way we can build a bunch of boxes that either stack, sit horizontally next to each other, or if you want to get fancy, they can overlap each other. At a high level, that's basically how layouts are coded as well. In order to code the layout of our design, we use a language called HTML, which we'll talk about very soon. But to keep things simple for this section, we can think of all elements in two simple forms: block and inline. There are others like grid, flicks, and more, but we won't get to them for this video. Block elements always start on a new line and take the full available width, and you can think of them as literal blocks. Inline elements don't start on a new line and only take as much space as they need on a page. We can actually see this on the browser. I'm going to open up my developer tools by right-clicking and selecting Inspect Elements. If you're using Safari, the developer tools wouldn't be available by default. You have to enable it first. Link down below to an article on how to do that. Over here we have an element called H1, which is a heading element. That by default is displayed as a block element. If I hover over it, you can see the highlighted area, which indicates it's taking over the entire space. We also have a button element, which by default is displayed as inline, which means it only takes as much space as it needs. And if you add another heading underneath the heading and another button underneath the button, the heading would stack underneath and the button would basically get placed right next to the other button. By knowing the difference between block and inline elements, we can easily section out our design into appropriate sections. Always start from outside in. You can think of this page as a giant box. You can think of the invisible wrapper that holds all of our content together as another box. You can then break the page further down into section boxes that stack, and then you can break them further into smaller boxes that either stack or sit right next to each other. Now we're ready for a quick HTML crash course. The first language we're going to talk about is HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language. HTML is not a programming language, it's a markup language. It doesn't allow you to write logic, but it does hold the layout and structure of your site or application, which can include anything like links, images, tables, text, and everything else that you usually find on a web page. It also holds other things that you don't see, like metadata, scripts, style sheets, and more, but we'll get to those later. To create a HTML file, you simply create a file with the .html extension. The extension .html basically tells the browser what this file is and how to deal with processing it. The index.html file is the most common name used for the default page of most websites or apps. In other words, index.html is the name used to refer to the home page of your site. When you visit most websites, you technically land on a .html page, and you can create other pages by simply renaming your file to things like about.html, contact.html, and so on. Alright, for the rest of the video, I'm going to be using my favorite code editor called VS Code. You could download VS Code from the code.visualstudio.com. I will leave a link to this down below. However, since this is not a coding tutorial, you don't really need to follow this, and I'm only doing this as a demonstration of how these different technologies work, and just so that I could explain the entire system to you guys a little bit better. Starting with any project, you want to create a folder structure somewhere on your computer. And for me, I've gone ahead and done that within my documents folder, which is right over here. I've just created a folder called HTML example. I'm going to open this up. I've got access to that folder. And now I'm simply going to create a file within over here by right-clicking and clicking on new file and just type in index.html. Just like that, I technically now have a HTML file. I'm just going to close this window. Let me also zoom in. Now, we can create a HTML document structure in VS Code by simply pressing the bang and either pressing tab, or we could just click on the bang over there, and it automatically creates this layout for us. Now, let's go ahead and explain this layout. We've got the doctop declaration, which is this piece over here. It's not a HTML tag, it's basically an information tag. It's a piece of information that tells the browser about the type and the version of the HTML that we're declaring. I'm not really going to get into the details as it's not really useful for this video, but just keep that in mind. And if you want more detail on this, you could just simply Google it. Going further down, we've got this HTML tags, and notice how when I select it, it automatically highlights the closing tag as well for me. I'm going to indent these guys in just so that we could read this a little bit easier. And that's what it kind of looks like. So we've got this two HTML opening and closing tags. And basically this is the root of our HTML document. Every other tag other than the doc type will sit between these two tags. Then we have these things called the head tags. So I'm going to create a gap between them again just so that we could see them easier. The head tag is basically responsible for holding your page's title, metadata, style sheets, scripts, and more. Just a side note, metadata just means data about data, and most things that sit within the head tag are usually not rendered directly on the page, but they do communicate a bunch of behaviors to the browser. This can range from multiple things like the character coding that the browser should use over here, how it should render the page, which basically these two lines are responsible for, and there are tons of other ones. Like an example of it would be this meta description, which is basically the description feed that gets used on Google search when you search for something, just at the bottom over here. And we'll cover the rest of this stuff a little bit later. Now, the title tag. One of the most common tags that sit within the head tag is the title tag, which represents the title of this HTML document. So I'm gonna go ahead and quickly run this on my browser. And you can see that I get this blank page over here. If I was to right click and open up my developer tools, you can see most of the stuff that we already have within the HTML document that I've created as well. So that's the description that we just added. And then we've got this title tag over here, which holds the letters of document. Now, have a look at the tab bar over here, and I can directly edit some of this HTML code within here, and it's not going to stay. So if I was to just add some numbers over there and press enter, notice how the tab itself changes as well. But then once I refresh the page, that's going to go away because the stuff that we do inside the inspector are not permanent and they only happen on our browser only. Now, this title tag has SEO value, and it can also create an identification for your website and its particular pages, as you have a different one per page. So for example, if this was my website called My Cool Website, and then I could just add a pipe character over here and name this one homepage. And if I was to save this and go back to my browser, you can see that that's now changed to My Cool Website homepage. Now let's move on to two more tags over here. We've got the link tag and we've got the script tags. Basically, if you need to import a piece of CSS or a piece of JavaScript, this is how you would import them. You create this link tag, you tell it what it is, which is a style sheet, and then you basically link to it within your folder structure. And we'll go through that as we build this website. Same with the script tag. Now with the link tag, it is self-closing, but with the script tag, you need to have an opening and a closing HTML tag over here. And then you just basically add a source instead of a href, and you just link it to a script file. Although you don't see the content under the head tag directly within your HTML file, they do hold a lot of important information and items about your website. However, for this course, to keep things simple, we're mostly going to concentrate on the body tag. Basically, everything under the body tag is responsible for all the visible and rendered parts of your HTML document. Most of your tags that build up the structure of your site will sit within here. With that in mind, let's introduce a bunch of HTML tags. First and foremost, let's talk about the div tag. At first, the div tag might be a little bit confusing, but essentially you can use a div tag to define a division or a section of your document. I think it might actually stand for division, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But what it does, essentially, it creates this invisible box outline that we've talked about, and you can group your items together. You can kind of think of this as when you group things in your design by using Command or Control G. And you can also have divisions inside of divisions, so essentially groups inside of groups. In the old days, entire HTML documents were written and divided using divs. However, more recently, in the past few years, there has been a more semantic way of writing our divs with the introduction of HTML5 in order to make them easier to read and understand by humans. But it also provides SEO value to your page, as search engines can index and identify your page better. But essentially, they work in the exact way as a div. With that said, let's go ahead and start building our design. Just as before, I've created a folder within my documents and I've called it example. Within that folder, I'm going to start creating my first file, and I'll just click that and I'll call it index.html, and I'll just click on the exclamation mark, press enter, and we've got our document. So you've seen this before, nothing new over here. I'm just going to save this. The only thing I'm going to do is to change this to coding for designers, and I'm just going to call this my homepage. Perfect. And I'm going to close this so we don't have to look at that and just concentrate in this part, which is our body. Now, within our body, the body is essentially the page that you'll see. And let me just go ahead and start a live server with this. Perfect, right there. So we got nothing over here at the moment. Now, the first thing I want to do is to create the surface area of my entire grid width. And the way that I would do that is simply by introducing my first div tag. So I'm just going to go div, press tab, and I have myself the div tag. Perfect. Then underneath that, I'm going to press enter, and this is basically grouping everything that I'm going to place within here now. Within my div tag, we want to first code this navigation, and let's just break it down. The navigation has a container that holds all of these guys within. Then it has another container for the image. Then it has another container for all of my nav links, and then it has another container for my CTA. So basically it's one massive div, then it has a div here, a div here, and a div here. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm just gonna create a gap over here just so that we could read them better. So this is my outside container. Then we have our first div, which is a nav. So div number 1, and then inside our nav, we have our div for the logo. Then we have the div for the nav links, and then we have the div for the CTA. As I said, with the introduction of HTML5, to make this more legible for humans and to be able to index elements better, there were the introduction of different tags. And the first tag I'm going to introduce you guys to is the nav tag. Essentially, it just represents where your navigation goes, and it behaves in the exact same way as a div. It's basically a block element. Cool, now that's a nav tag out of the way. Let's go ahead and deal with the rest of the areas. Because these areas are basically just a group of items, I'm just going to use the div tag to represent them. At the moment, if I go ahead and save this, you still can't see anything on my page, except for the fact that if I go ahead and bring up my developer tools, and you can see that now I have all of these elements right over here, exactly as I've coded them. I'm going to leave this up so we could go back and forth between the two. Awesome. Now, within the first div tag, I'm going to introduce you guys to a new tag called the image tag. And it's just a tag that represents my image. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how do I actually link this to my image? And what are these blue colored elements over here? Well, let's start with the blue color elements. Every single HTML tag has these things called attributes. And attributes basically allow us to provide more information for that tag to give it a specific behavior. In the sense of an image tag, first of all, it's a self-closing tag, so it doesn't need another tag in order to close it. And another way, by the way, to write a self-closing tag is that you don't even really need to have the / over here. You could just write it like this. And within over here, first we have the source attribute, then we have the alt attribute. The idea of an alt attribute is that I could basically just give this image a name, and I know that this is my logo, so I'm going to call it logo, and I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go back to the design. And now you can see that the image itself doesn't load, but since we have a name for the image called logo, it displays that instead, which is kind of like a good backup in case your image for whatever reason fails to load. But it's also good for both screen readers, and it's also good for the SEO of your web pages as well, as some search engines actually read the name of your logo and start indexing them that way as well. Now you might be asking yourself, how do I bring this guy over there? Well, that's quite simple. If I double click on this, you can see that this is essentially just a group that I've named logo that I can export. And within Figma, if you don't know, you could very simply click on the plus on the export, and you could choose the type that you want to export it as. And I want to export this as a SVG image. So I'm going to click on SVG, and I'm going to click on export logo. Now, in this case, this was just downloaded because I'm using the web app, but if you were to use the desktop app, you actually get to save it in a location of your choice. So I'm going to bring up my example folder that I created over here, and I'm going to create another folder within here by pressing Command Shift and N on my keyboard on a Mac, and I'm going to rename this to images. And inside images, I'm just going to basically drag and drop this guy right in there as logo. So now this basically exists in an environment that I might be uploading into a server. So let's go back to the code and get an understanding of how I'm going to bring this in. So with the source attribute over here, I can very simply, you can see that the image folder is right there, and I just basically need to tell it to look within this folder and load this image and load it to the browser, which is quite easy to do. You basically just go // which basically means look within the same folder, and VS Code basically allows me to do this with using the interface. So I could just open up my image folder and then select the logo.svg. Now, if I go ahead and save this, hopefully we're going to see this on the browser. Perfect, right there. Now we have the image on the browser. The next thing that we want to do is to take care of the nav links. So let's go back to my VS Code again. And again, I'm going to create a gap so that these are easier to read. The way that we introduce any link that you want to introduce in your HTML file, you use a tag called the anchor tag, and we represent that by just an A. And just like that, you have yourself an anchor tag, and you can see it has its own attribute, and I'm going to explain that in a second. Now, again, if I was to save this, nothing would really happen because I haven't filled this with anything, but between the two tags, I can very simply just write down whatever I had in my design. And if I go back to my design again, we have home, about, and contact. So I'm going to go back to VS Code. We've got home, about, and contact. I'm just copying them and just typing in home, about, contact. Now, what is this href for? This basically provides the destination for these links to point to. And we'll come back to fill the destinations later, but it's good practice to use a pound character if we're not filling these at the moment with a path. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just enter pound in there. And we'll come back to this, but I just want to save this and show you guys that once we do this, we now have our links. Kind of like the design. I mean, it's not really there yet, but we'll get there very soon. And the final thing is the button. The button's quite simple. Again, we're going to go inside our div tags over here, open it up, and just type in button and press enter. And that's how you create a button tag, and you just basically fill it in. And within our design, we have get started, and I'm just going to do the exact same thing in my code. I'm just going to type in get started, press save, and there we go. We now have a get started button. Perfect. Now realize that my A tags are inline. Because of the fact that I've used a div tag, it actually takes the entire space available to it. And I can actually show you guys by hovering over these. So the nav you can see is a block element. These divs are individual blocks, but if I go into here, the image is not. The image is an inline element. These links are inline elements. And lastly, the button is also an inline element. Cool. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and build the rest of this page out. We now need to create this area. So if I zoom out and go to my box model over here, I'm going to hide the navigation. So we've already done that. In order to do the header, it's actually quite simple as well. As you can see, we have a box that covers the whole thing. I'm just going to group all of these together. Then I'm going to group the title and a paragraph. Then I'm going to wrap my image inside its own group, and then I'm going to group my two buttons as well. You're already familiar with most of these tags. The only one that you don't currently know is the header tag. So let's just go ahead and introduce you guys to our new tag called the header. I'm going to create that tag outside of the nav, and I'm just going to type header, press enter. Again, the idea of a header is that it's going to behave exactly like a typical div. The only difference over here is that it's kind of a unique tag. You have a header tag and you also have a footer tag, and you only want to have one header per page and one footer per page in each of your HTML documents. So that's basically what's going to hug the entire header area. Underneath this, I'm going to, as I said, create one div for my title and paragraph. I'm going to create another div for my image, and I'm going to create another div to group my buttons together. And I'm going to create a gap between these guys. Within the first div, I'm going to use a h1 to represent my title. Headings are basically titles or subtitles that you want to display on a web page. Headings are defined with the h1 all the way through to h6 tags, with the h1 being the most important text on your page that you only almost want to use once per page, and h6 being the least important of those titles or subtitles. And paragraph tags are quite simple as well. You just basically represent them with a P, and that's how you create a paragraph. Now, I'm going to go back to my design and I'm going to fill these guys up. So I'm just gonna copy this and paste it inside my h1 tag. And I'm going to copy this and paste this inside my paragraph tag. Great. Now, if I go back to the website, you can see them right over here. So we've got coding for designers and we've got our paragraph. Then we're going to need to do our image. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click on my image. I'm just going to export it as a 2x PNG. I'm just going to move this. Perfect. So now we have a home.png, and I can actually bring that in the same way that I brought in the other image file by simply going back over here, creating an image tag inside my alt text. I'm just going to call this hero image. And inside my source, again, I'm going to go period, look inside my images and look for hero home.png. And if I go ahead and save this, you should be able to see this on the site. Perfect. It's right over here. It's a little bit big, but we'll take care of that once we hit CSS. Underneath that, I'm just going to introduce my 2 buttons, and we've done that before, so that's quite simple. Just going to create 2 button tags, and the first one is going to be called Get Started, and second one is going to be called Change It Up. Cool. If I go back to my HTML file, now you should be able to see the buttons. And that's the general HTML structure of my home, and we're just basically gonna have to fix this up with CSS in order to make it look like the design. All right, and just like that, we've created this simple, beautiful website. Learned quite a bit while doing it, so let's move on to styling this bad boy in CSS. So before we get started with CSS, let's just get some things out of the way. Is CSS a programming language? Well, no, it's a style sheet language. Although throughout the years it has grown into a more complex and capable language, it's still not necessarily considered a programming language. With that in mind, let's get started. When it comes to development, it's always a good idea to organize your files. So for example, I placed all of my images inside this image folder, and in the same way, I'm going to organize my CSS files, and I'm going to create a folder over here. I'm going to call it styles, and all of our CSS files I'm going to create within here. I'm going to create 3 CSS files, one called reset.css, another one called base.css, and then the last one called styles.css. I'll come back to the why behind these in just a second, but let's just close that folder for now and go back to our index. Now we're going to need a way for our HTML file to be able to communicate everything that we start placing into our CSS files. How do we do that? Well, there are a couple of different ways. However, to keep this lesson simple, I'm only going to show you guys one of them, which is also considered the best practice in most cases. And that is simply by importing an external CSS files. If you remember, as I said, we place our CSS import files within the head. So I'm just going to click enter, type in link, select CSS, press enter. We get 2 different attributes. We've got the rel, which basically the way for us to tell what type of a link import it is. It's a style sheet. And then the href is basically what source was within the image. It's a path to our CSS file. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to go period /, which indicates look within the current folder. We're going to look within the styles folder, and first we're going to bring in the reset. I'm going to copy this down 2 more times. Then I'm going to bring in base, and lastly I'm going to bring in styles. The order of which you bring your files in matters, and that's because the way that the browser reads your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files is basically top down, line by line. So it reads this line, it validates it, it does whatever it needs to do, and it runs to the next line. And the same thing happens within your CSS. Cool. Let's go ahead and explain why we're bringing in 3 different files. Basically because we want to have an organization and understand what's going on within each file. And secondly, let's go and explain each of these documents as well. The first thing that you see over here is a reset.css. And if I was to open this up, I already have this link open. We're going to bring in this normalize.css, which you could just simply Google for, and I will leave a link to it down below. And what this does, different browsers render HTML files quite differently by default. So there is a whole bunch of default behaviors that browsers provide to begin with. So for example, Internet Explorer might be different to Chrome, and Chrome might be different to Firefox. And this could cause issues further down the road if you don't take care of this early on. So we create this file called the reset.css, and we use something like this. There are other ones available, but this is the one that I use. It's called normalize. And I'm just going to paste this right inside my reset.css, and that's just gonna help me create a bit of default consistency no matter which browser the end user might use. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and all that does to our design, it just basically removes some of the paddings and removes some of the default behaviors out of some of these elements, so you can't really see much of it happening over here. So I'm going to go ahead and close reset.css. Then let's explain base.css. The way that CSS works is you want to create a base behavior for all of your base tags. Now, what do I mean by that? if I go to my design, we can identify some common patterns over here. So for example, all of my A tags seem to look the same. My buttons have some common attributes like a border radius, some background coloring, some font weight, so on and so forth. Even though these two buttons are a different size, there are still some common attributes that a button in general might have. And these are the stuff that you want to define within your base file and kind of like set and forget about them. So I'm going to go back to my code editor and paste this code over here. And let's just go ahead one by one and explain each of these lines. This first line basically imports all the fonts that I use. At the moment, I'm using Playfair Display and I'm also using Poppins. Out of those, I'm using the font weight 900 for Playfair Display, and that's basically translates to the black font. And you can see that within your inspect over here, it tells me if I click on inspect on Figma and look at the font weight, it says 900. That's how I know. And the next one is Poppins, which I'm using 500 and 600 weight. Both of these fonts are straight from Google Fonts, and if you were to go over there, you can simply get a link like this from the fonts that you want to import. Next, let's explain how CSS works. If you were to type in HTML or body, you're basically referring to the HTML or the body tag straight within your HTML file. You type in and you separate the two by a comma. So you're basically telling CSS that I want these styles within here to apply to the HTML and the body tag. And you open up your statement with the curly brackets and you type in your statement within here. So you're telling your HTML and body to have a font family of Poppins. Everything else over here are backups just in case Poppins doesn't load. Then you're telling your entire HTML or body to take a background color of this hex code over here. And the way that you find out what hex code you need to be your background color is basically driven straight from the design. So it's the same code as this over here. And the same thing with color. So color represents the paragraph or basically a generic color that gets used on your typography. And that is taken from here. And you have your font weight that we talked about. It gets taken straight from the design. Then there is a general styling that I want to provide for all of my heading tags, H1 all the way through to H6. They basically share a font family together, which is the Playfair, and then they share a color together, which is this hex code straight from the design as well. Now, some of these you've seen and some of these you haven't. The ones that we specifically care about in this design are the buttons. The rest of these guys you haven't seen. This basically says font family inherit, and what it does is you basically say, I want the font family of my button to be whatever that was defined within my HTML and body. That's what inherit means. Then a little bit further down, you got the button. So as I said, the button, although they're different sizes, there are some commonalities between them. So for example, they don't use a border. None of them do. They have a border radius of 4 pixels. They have the same font weight, and the cursor pointer basically refers to what happens when you hover over them with your cursor. We want the pointer, we want this hand to appear. And at the very end, we've got a default behavior for our image, which is a width of 100%. And the 100% basically tells the image to resize itself depending on the browser size. And I'll just go ahead and display how that works for you guys in a sec as well. So let's go back to our design. And if I go back to my design, some things should have changed. So we should have brought in the different font colors and font families, and the button styles should have changed slightly. So let's go ahead and open it up. And you can see that because I'm telling my browser to 100% the image, you get this massive image over here. We'll fix that later. But as I scroll down, you can see that the font family has changed for all the elements. The title now has its different font family. And as I go down, the same thing has happened for my buttons down here, and they get that cursor. Great. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and style the rest of our page. As you might have noticed, there are some issues that we need to take care of. Let's refer to the buttons, and let me just bring up the design. Notice that I have different styles of buttons over here. However, if I just come over here into my CSS and just add a background color of red, for example, to one of my buttons, you can see that this button is red, but both of these buttons are also red. However, if you look at the design, I've got 2 burgundy color buttons over here, and we've got 1 creamy color down here. So how do we specifically target these elements over here in order to create unique buttons? So that's where the class and ID attributes come in. almost every single HTML element with your body tag can have a class or an ID identification attribute. One purpose of IDs and classes is that you can create this communication link between your HTML and your CSS and your JavaScript files by giving them unique identifications. It's almost like giving your tags distinctive names to be able to target them later. IDs are unique, so you can only have one ID per HTML file and you cannot repeat it in the same HTML file. With classes, however, you can repeat the same class as many times as you like in an HTML file. A good rule of thumb is to always use classes when it comes to CSS and HTML styling, unless you have a really good reason to use an ID and want something super specific for an element. Another thing that I want to leave you guys with is how we represent classes and IDs within CSS and how we generally just write CSS as well. In CSS, classes are represented by the period character and IDs are represented by the pound character. So basically the way that you would write the CSS class is you start with a period, then the CSS name, and then you're opening and closing curly brackets, and then you type your CSS between the two brackets. And with IDs, it's very similar. Instead of a period, you use a pound, and then the ID name, and then your brackets, and then your CSS between the brackets. So to give you an example of how IDs and classes work, let's go back to our buttons again. For the first button over here, I'm going to give it a class attribute. And the way that you do a class is you just type in class equals to, you open up your quotation characters and you give it a name. Now, this name could be anything as long as instead of using spaces, you either do camel casing, so which is like any and then thing. The T could be uppercase, or you'd go lowercase everywhere, but you separate the two with a hyphen, which is the typical convention of how you could name different classes. You could also provide more than just one class. So I could go anything and then I could go class black, and I totally just made both of these names up. And later on, I could go into my CSS over here and refer to them and style them uniquely. Let me delete this and do this for real. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a button small class and then a button primary class. It's a good idea to actually define what this button does, so we know that this is a primary button and it's going to be a small size button. And with these two guys over here, I'm going to create a button. So the first one's going to be a button primary as well, because if I go back to the design, you can see that it takes the same attributes as that other button, and it's going to be a size of medium. Again, the order doesn't really matter, as it's going to pick up both of these classes. And the second one is going to be button secondary and button medium as well. So in order to style these now, I'm just going to go into my styles.css, period, button small, and then the brackets. And I know that I also have a medium button, and I know that I have a button primary, a button secondary. And just like this, I can now target those buttons individually. I'm just going to provide an example for the primary and the small, and the rest I'm just going to fast forward so you guys don't have to watch me type all of these in. For button small, I'm going to define a font size of 14 pixels. And how do I know it's 14 pixels? Because it's coming straight from here. So I know that it's 14 pixels and a line height of 24 pixels. So 24 pixels. And then we're going to give it a padding. So where does the padding come from? Well, I created this to be a auto layout, and the padding I could actually take straight from my button attribute. So if I was to open this up, we know that top and bottom is 8 pixels and left and right are 16 pixels. And padding, the way you would represent that in CSS, if your top and bottom and left and right padding are the same, the top and bottom value is the first number, which is 8 pixels, and the left and right value are the second number, which is 16 pixels. Let's go ahead and save this and look at our button small in the code over here. We can see that it now looks a lot more like the button that we had in the code. So that defines the size of our small button. And then next, it's a primary button. First, I'm going to remove that red color from here, and just notice that it is also taking a whole bunch of attributes from the original button tag. So within our primary, I know that the text color is white as per the design. I also know that it has a background color, which is this hex code right over here. And I'm going to save this. And if I go back to my design, the button now looks like the actual design button. I'm going to fast forward and type all the CSS that I need for this, and I'm going to explain it to you guys. Okay, since this is not a full-on HTML and CSS course, I just went away and I just pasted all of these pre-filled items over here, and I'm just going to explain what they do. So let's go one-to-one with the design. If we look at our box design over here, and if I was to turn on this grid, and if we were to compare this to what we got over here, we know that we have a container grid that creates this invisible barrier for all of my design. Further down, we have a navigation container. This is how we would style everything within this navigation up here. Then we have our main logo, so I call it the main logo. Then we have the navigation links, navigation button container, and that's how I've gone ahead and created my different sections. And if you look at the CSS as well, over here, I've provided all the different attributes that it needs. So for example, the max width of my container is this, which is 1224 pixels. And I also need to center it in the page, which is the CSS hack called the margin zero auto. I'm not going to explain what it does exactly, maybe in the next video, but you can see that I've gone ahead and I've coded the entire CSS and hooked it up to my HTML as well. The only thing that you guys haven't seen is this display flex, but that's where things get a little bit more complex, and I'll explain this in a later video as well. But if you go back to our design and refresh it, we should now have the exact same design as you see on the design file, which is right up over here. One last thing that I just want to introduce to you guys is for these interactions to happen, so like we've got the hover effects, the way that you would code this within your CSS is you would have a primary button and then you would use a column hover, and you just basically tell it what sort of a behavior it should have once you hover over it. So in this case, we wanted the background color to change. And as you can see, if I hover over my button, the background color goes darker. So these are the things that you want to define for the developers in order to implement every time you're designing one of these things. Although this is a lot to take in, we still have one more section to take care of, which is basically the JavaScript section. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, let's deal with the final part of this video, which is JavaScript. JavaScript is a proper programming language. Nowadays, it's capable of doing a lot, and I mean a lot. You can build both front-end and back-end applications using JavaScript through specific frameworks. You can even write native mobile and desktop apps. It's also amongst the most popular programming languages in the world. In order for me to explain how JavaScript works, it's a whole course on its own, which I am working on, but to keep this video simple, let's think of JavaScript in this context as if you wanted more complex logical interactions added to your page, that's when you would reach out for JavaScript. For example, let's say that every time I press this button over here, this text over here would change to a random text. And if I go to my Figma file, I've gotten these 4 texts over here. I also don't want it to just change from one to the next to the next. I just wanted to randomly select one of these texts and display it instead of coding for designers. The way that we would approach this is we start by creating our JavaScript file. So going back to here, again, I'm going to separate my scripts into a folder called scripts and press enter. You would just go over here, right click, new file, and I'm going to call my file script.js, and .js is the extension we use to create JavaScript files, and we have a JavaScript document over here. And very simply, underneath the header, I'm going to create a script with a source pointed to my JavaScript file. And now we have a link to our JavaScript document. The reason why we add this line of code to the bottom of the document is that we want the whole document to load first with all of its HTML elements, so that when our JavaScript runs and looks for a specific element, it's already loaded and actually exists on the page. The way that we will now create a communication between our script file and our HTML file is very similar to CSS, is through classes and IDs. With JavaScript, you can use either, but you have to think about which one would be more suitable for your specific need. A lot of JavaScript hooks are unique and attach themselves to a single element. So that's where IDs make the most sense. I also know that in order to implement this logic, a user needs to interact with this button over here. So I'm going to add an ID over here called changed-text. And I also know that this is the heading that's going to take that change. So I'm going to add another ID over here called hero title. And just like this, I can now hook to both of these via my JavaScript by simply creating 2 variables that point to those specific IDs within our HTML. I'm just going to paste this code over here. However, I'm not really going to explain the code as I don't want this part to be more complex, as this is just an introduction to programming concepts for designers. But if I was to go ahead and save this and close this file, we have the code that's going to attempt to do that logic. We basically give it a list of all the text that we wanted to go through. We then create a function that returns a random text to us. And then we grab that random text and we change the heading 1 title over here. And we basically put all of that logic based on the user's click on that button. I'm just going to close this, open up my browser, go back to my design, refresh it, and hopefully when I click on change it up, there we go. It now changes to one of those random text every time I click on it. Now, one bonus thing is when I click on about.html, at the moment in the code, I've said, go and look within the same folder and look for a file called about.html and load it. Let's go ahead and quickly make that. New file, call it about.html. And basically it's going to be a very similar code base. However, I'm going to have to go ahead and add the image. If we refresh this, we'll get this, but we don't have the image yet. I'm just going to quickly add the image there as well, because this is our about. Our about is basically the same as our homepage. However, in this case, the title and the paragraph are underneath the image instead of above. So basically the layout would be the same, except for the fact that the code for this section would just need to get pushed down. And I'm just going to go ahead and quickly export this out as well and chuck it into our folder. And if I go in here, there we go. We now have our homepage and our about page. And if we go to the homepage, we could just click over here to change the title at the top. And as I said, basically the container that withholds our title and the text is now at the bottom, and the image is now at the top. I know there was a lot in this video, but I hope that it provided you guys with a door into realizing how design gets converted into code. I'll make a thorough video for each of these topics in the future, but for now, I'm going to leave you guys with this. And I hope that it's been helpful to you guys. And we're done. Now you have a basic understanding of how a simple website is put together. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want me to cover anything else in more detail, or if you have any questions, just comment them down below. I am working on a ton of other videos for designers covering topics about design, coding, career development, and more. So if you're interested, feel free to subscribe down below, like this video, share it with others if you think this could help someone else as well. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. You wear a hat, they call dad. Me, I'm the dad in the hat. You just like clubbing and clothes. Me, I like afternoon naps. 3, I be missed for the road. My oldest like counting racks. My middle one, she's in a dirt bike. My youngest is just